What is going on, everybody? This is the Parallax Viewer, and this is your host, the Big Signorelli, aka the Big Sig. And this is our fourth installment for the Seminar 16 of Jacques Lacan, entitled From Another to the Other. Now, we're going to do it very similar to how the first two installments were, line by line exegesis. But I want to recap and just get straight into it on what we discussed in the last one, which was quite different. The first time I ever used the whiteboard. Um, and so I got a little bit of practice in before starting this one, but I want to refresh everybody's memory who watched the last one because it was in regards to the topology of the other. Now, it was my summary and a working paper that I'm doing regarding not only the section entitled Topology of the Other, but on the topology of the other itself. Now, what the topology of the other entails is it's in regards to what Lacan has been saying about structure as the realist, because it converges towards its own impossibility, that it's the essence of psychoanalysis. Insofar as in psychoanalytic theory, its essence is a discourse without speech. And he elaborates on this through set theoretical mathematical logic as a topology of the subject, which is also a topology of jouissance, and this subject could not exist without an other, because for a discourse to happen, it is an agent addressing an other, right? And the truth condition of the discourse is, or as its cause, is the subject, right? And the subject is split between truth and knowledge, right? Now, let's get into this. I'm going to share the whiteboard so that we can recap on what was said in the last one. So he was using set theory, and pretty much what getting at is this little John right here, right? So the axiom of, or the logic of the signifier is the signifier represents a subject to another signifier, right? Which is this, right? Now, this is the split between knowledge and truth. This is the subject of science, right? The subject of science is also the subject in which psychoanalytic praxis situates itself in. So the cause of discourse, right, is going to be this, which is on the side of truth, right? And then we have an agent, right, which is going to be the S1, or just a signifier, which would represent a subject to another signifier, which this S2 represents a chain of K, meaning knowledge, right? So it is an entire battery of signifiers. Now, one of the things I want to kind of correct um, in regards to the set theory stuff, because the set theory, or the Russell set, which is a set which would contain all sets that do not contain themselves. Now, what is a set? Set is a formalized concept in pure mathematical logic of anything that contains or represents elements, variables, members that do not relate or contain or represent themselves, right? Now, we could call these ordered pairs. So the ordered pair S and A for Lacan, right? It's going to be the signifier which represents the subject, and then the chain of signification, the chain of knowledge, the chain of meaning, the field of meaning, which is the other. And what I want to correct is the fact that I said that S, this ordered pair, S, contains S a 1 and barred A or barred S, but that's not true. It's just S1. And he even states that in the text. And the other set is going to be S1 as well as S2. So that is your two ordered pairs. Now, why do I say this? Well, because if there is the superset or if there is the signifier that will complete the discourse, right? Think of this as a discourse trying to contain all discourse. This goes back to there is no meta language or there is no universe of discourse, meaning a universe that is enclosed by discourse for discourse, a discourse that would represent itself, right? And the elementary form of a language or a discourse is a signifier, right? And the signifier not only represents the subject to another signifier, but signifiers don't get their meaning on their own. They don't refer to themselves for their meaning. They have to refer to other signifiers for their meaning. So the Russell's paradox or the Russell set in terms of signifiers it is an impasse at the side of formalization because the signifier S1, which represents the subject to another signifier, is making a choice between representing the subject and also trying to complete A, right? Because A is going to be the field of meaning, the field of all signifiers. But what would be the last signifier? Because the more you keep going, the more that each signifier has to refer to another signifier for its entire uh, meaning. And so what we end up realizing is that a signifier tries to enclose the universe of discourse to complete it, to thus make a universe of discourse. But in reality, there is no signifier, right? That would be able to close or encapsulate the field of meaning, the field of knowledge, aka the big other. So this, which is also seen in the graph of desire as S and A, which is also known as like the subject of enunciation, the I, really becomes S and barred A to show that there is no signifier for the other. The other capital O big A lacks a signifier, right? This is the problem. This is what happens. This is exemplary of what we encounter in primal repression, meaning that the child, which is caught in a series of demands, addressed to the mother function or the other who satisfies the demands, encounters and not only an inconsistency uh in the other from the other, but also a fundamental gap, right? And this is where we enter into primal repression, and this would lead to the forced choice of entering into castration to repress this encounter, right? And so Lacan will elaborate, and he says on this, and he says something really nice towards the end of Topology of the Other. Let me find this. He says right here, if this suffices to strike you and hold your attention, you will see that what follows will spell out what this implies about the place of analytic investigation between the chain of demand and the chain of enunciation as we see it on the graph. And he's talking about the graph of desire. The subject of enunciation is only enunciated as he, in quotes, whereas what appears not only by way of demand, but by way of the relationship of demand to the chain of enunciation appears as I and you. And he says that that will be the topic of the next class, right? And the next class is on the fact of facts and what is said, which will go on about discourse, the function of the signifier, and the problem of the other. But this is a recap of ultimately what's going on right here. And though you're not talking about discourse in seminar 17, this is a precursor because what we're dealing with is surplus jouissance, right? This is what comes out in the effect of the impossibility of this relationship. There's always a remainder, right? This doesn't just necessarily mean whole and structure, but also excess, a remainder that could never enter the relationship of the chain of knowledge, which would lead to completion, but always a remainder that is left out, something that does not work. This is entropy. This is whole. This is excess. This is waste. This is exactly what civilization, not culture, is based upon. The management of A, which is trash and shit. Publication of discourse. Okay? So I'm going to close this out and I'm going to share the other page. All right. Should be full screen. That was weird. Yeah. Okay. So hopefully that was insightful. And again, I would recommend rewatching that and um or the last one, which I go into a basic summary of set theoretical mathematics with relation to the signifier and its logic. So the facts and what is said. Let us get straight to work since we are running behind today. Our last class revolved around the other, capital O, what I call the other with a capital O. It ended with me proposing certain schemas whose somewhat fascinating appearance alone I said we should not dwell on, for they should be linked to a logical articulation, the one involving the relationship between one signifier and another. In order to draw out the consequence of this relationship, I endeavored to articulate it by beginning with the function of the ordered pairs as laid out in set theory. At least I tried on this logical basis to convey to you the crux of the interest I hope we all have in hearing the following point clearly articulated. The other with a capital O in its function, such as I have already broached it, encloses no knowledge about which we can presume, let us say, that it will someday become absolute. Note that by saying presume, I am gesturing towards the future, whereas I usually gesture toward the past by enunciating that referring to the other props up the erroneous notion that knowledge is already there in the other. I will not begin with that, but I want to mention it, for I will return to it later. So this logical articulation of the signifier, and as it relates to the other again, without going ad nauseum, is the fact that the logical articulation relates to the fact that the signifier, by its very nature and function, must refer to another signifier for meaning, for some type of uh, signification or articulation. Insofar as that, of course, a discourse, which is an assemblage of signifiers, for lack of a better term, is caused, of course, by a condition, the subject, right, which splits itself between truth and knowledge, and yet its effect, which is always a remainder, um, is in a gap between its cause, right? So, and this is the fact that the subject who's represented by the signifier, its signifier doesn't have its own meaning or its own referent. The subject is not a referent. The subject is an absence. The subject is not present. It's only the signifier that presents itself as a representative in absence, right? It's like its secretary. Oh, such and such is not here, so I'm going to relay this message to you from them. And that's literally what these signifiers are doing. And not only that, but also trying to articulate some type of knowledge, which would be a field of meaning, a field of uh or network of knowledge. um and this whole thing about absolute knowledge is that it's like, in all right, uh we aren't able to complete the field of knowledge right now, hence it's something that science does, but tomorrow we will know more, right? um Keep that in mind, right? The other is not complete. We don't know if it will be, at least today, but maybe tomorrow. But the reality is that there's also a sort of dilemma in which all the knowledge that is pretty much already present in this is something of the past, right? Repressed knowledge, knowledge in the real, right? That comes about uh, from the subject, from a certain vantage point. Subject, science. Subject, jouissance. Subject, who whose discourse, unconscious discourse, is also the discourse of the other, right? So see how we're stringing in all these different definitions and tropes from Lacan all into one? It'll start making sense. It is extremely important for what is to come that the other be called into question here. There's nothing subversive about the statement that the other does not enclose any absolute knowledge that is either already there or to come. I recently read somewhere that the expression subversion of knowledge, situated at an ideal point, which shall moreover stay off in its corner, coin, as it were, this expression was supposedly proposed under my aegis. Yet I have absolutely never said or stated anything of that kind. Such slippages can only be considered highly regrettable, attesting as they do to a bogus use that is made of bits and pieces of my discourse that are not even properly detached, or rather, a reassemblage of terms that I would never have dreamt of assembling. In view of having the function in a market that would not be at all happy if I begin to colonize academia. I just love that, like in this seminar, we really get at the heart um, of the problem of university of knowledge as a market, insofar as it's also in relationship at this focal point with the rise of the capitalist market. Why is knowledge subverted just because it can't be made absolute? When the claim that it can be absolute whenever it shows its head, or whatever it has shown its head, has always been laughable. This word brings us to the heart of this matter, by which I mean the new path I am taking uses using puns in as much as they provoke laughter. They provoke laughter, in short, insofar as they are properly linked to the gap inherent in knowledge. If you will allow me to go off on a brief tangent, I will mention it in the connection, the first chapter of part three of volume one of Marx's Capital, the production of absolute surplus value, which is chapter seven, the labor process and the valorization process. In these few pages, we find something that I did not have to wait for recent studies on Marx's structuralism to notice, but that had struck me when I was around 20. This old volume that you see here, which is falling apart, I remember reading it on the way to the hospital in the vehicle I had at the time, namely the subway. Marx introduces surplus value. He introduces it a bit more value. It wouldn't have taken much for him not to introduce it at all. Neither surplus nor value. I'm messing with your minds. After debonairly allowing the capitalist to say his piece, Marx allows him to justify his position regarding the point at issue, namely the service he renders to the man who has but a rudimentary tool, a jointer plane, which to do his work by putting at his disposal a lathe and a milling machine. Thanks to this, the man will be able to work wonders, and there will be a fair exchange of good and even faithful service. Marx allows plenty of time for this plea, which seems like the most honest discourse in the world, to be laid out. but he points out that the ghost-like character across from him, the capitalist, then laughs. It was it was this superfluous detail that struck me when I first read the passage. It seemed to me at the time that the laughter was closely related to the essence of surplus value, which Marx then proceeded to unveil. Go on, mischievous fellow, in quotes, Marx, Marx as much says to the capitalist. Keep providing the worker with the means of production that you happen to possess, but you won't pay him any more for the work he does with your lathe and milling machine than you did for what he made with a simple plane, um, or jointer, varloop. As least with his plane he could assure his own sustenance. What I'm highlighting in this passing has never been noted before, naturally, as I will unable to mention it myself when I begin constructing the graph of desire on the basis of a pun. I'm referring to the conjunction of laughter with the radically avoided function of surplus value, whose relationship to the characteristic elision that is constitutive of objet A. I have already sufficiently indicated the jump shock a little bit more, a little bit less I spoke about earlier, the sleight of hand or pre uh, prestigitation that hits you in the gut when you hear a pun. All of that revolves around the fundamental relationship between laughter and elision. In short, here as elsewhere, I mean in the foundational function, this is hidden in the relationship between production and work, as elsewhere in another relationship that is more profound to I'm trying to lead you on the basis of surplus jouissance. There is something like a fundamental joke that is, strictly speaking, based on the joint into which we can jam our crowbar when we are dealing with the relationship involved in the experience of the unconscious, understood in its most general function, the unconscious structure like a language. This nevertheless does not imply that there can be any sort of theory of the unconscious. Trust me, I'm not aiming at anything of that kind. I will return to the statement since it too can give rise to improper formulations. There is assuredly a theory of psychoanalytic practice, but a theory of the unconscious. No, unless one intends to extend the scope of the theory of analytic practice, which regarding the unconscious gives us what can be taken from it in the field of practice and nothing else. To talk about a theory of the unconscious is to open the door to a ridiculous deviation that I would like to block, which has already paraded for years as applied psychoanalysis, and which, let's go up, and which has allowed for all sorts of abuses, especially in the fine arts. It is travesty along psychoanalysis way, which has led to a whole I find dishonorable. I won't go into it any further. Let us return to the topic at hand. The other merely provides the subject's fabric, namely his topology. So I want to stop right here and really kind of recap on what he was talking about regards to surplus value, the capitalist, the laughter, and elision. This is something that Daniel in his essay in on the logician or the savant highlights, and I mentioned it in our conversation too, and he kind of elaborates on it. But to kind of keep it simple, that what the joke is and the laughter of the capitalist is the fact that insofar as that there is this uh, circulation and production of movement of not only the commodity in exchange and the use value, but that this is highlighted in the macro level of the worker exchanging their labor power and time for a wage while the capitalist is making money off of that at the same time and value, but also the surplus value that comes about in the circulation and escapes, but then comes back in the form of a laughter because the capitalist, in a sort of perverted way, tries to take themselves into account in this process of laughter and elision as exploited workers, right? As victims of the process, if I understood Daniel explain it correctly. But I guess like why it's considered not only a joke, but why it relates to objet a and on the basis of a pun is because in the graph of desire, we have two chains going on. If you look at the first graph, is the a movement of the demand which splits into a subject on one end and the chain of meaning synchrony diachrony going this way. I think it's synchrony or diachrony, and the retroactive chain, which would create the split subject. Now, with the excess in objet a, there's always something trying to come back into that because, again, the signifier represents a subject for another signifier. This process still goes on to try to count and account for itself and contain the other, right? And the other being the field of meaning, the split subject ultimately being split, and Zizek kind of makes a really good um dumbed down version of this, like what it means to be a divided subject, and objet as a remainder is like you divide the subject so much that what you end up with is a scrap or a less than nothing, right? It's neither something or nothing, but it's a less than nothing. Um, and that doesn't just like remain outside. It's not pure difference or like some like difference in the Derridian sense. It's always trying to get back into the field of meaning, right? Because it is the sort of remainder of the other that the subject is situated in from that vantage point. And so when the subject tries to go back into the field of meaning, this remainder could lead into a pun, a sort of bungled action. And I didn't mention this in last episode, but in the topology of the other, we get the formulation of a bungled action in the intersection between the field of meaning and signification and the signifier and the subject in Heinrich Heine's character who recalls that this man addressed him familiarly, right? Family and millionaire uh, create a portmanteau out of the effect of a bungled action, which it is in here considered a pun, but I remember in our conversation with Paris, he, you know, breaks down the distinctions regarding this in Familiar as like there's a difference between um, witticism, joke, a pun, and la langue, which I'll just fucking put that in there because I don't want to take up too much time in explaining that. But the point is that there is this sort of homology of the way surplus jouissance and the way that it ruptures, you could say, the field of meaning or tries to enter in and invade the field of meaning in that way, which is this bungled action manifests the unconscious, and in the same way that surplus value in the form of the capitalist laughter enters in the field of exploitation in the exchange of commodities. Um, yeah, I don't know if that made any sense at all, if I just bastardized the whole thing, but if that did, cool beans. If it didn't, leave a comment in the chat, right? Um, so as he says, the other merely provides the subject's fabric, namely his topology, that by which the subject brings with him a subversion, certainly, but one that is not solely his own. What is at issue in the subversion of the subject, as I have labeled it and put it on the title of one of my writings in the Acree, with regards to what people had said about him prior to that time. Yet the subversion at stake here is one of the subject brings with him, of course, but which the real, which the perspective is defined as the impossible, makes use of. Now, at this precise point at which he is of interest to us, there's no subject except on the basis of the speech act, or on the basis of an instance of speaking or saying. I am thus proposing two references. one to the real and one to speaking. Here you may still be uncertain and wonder, for example, whether this is no more than what has always been imagined about the subject. Again, he says right here, one to the real, right? And one of the speaking. We must thus realize that the subject is the effect and the consequence of this saying. There is no subject except on the basis of a speech act. This is what we have to hone in on correctly in order to not detach the subject. To say, moreover, sorry, where was I? To say, moreover, that the real is the impossible is also to enunciate that the real is the tightest homing in on saying. Speech's tightest grip, insofar as saying introduces the impossible and does not simply enunciate it. Some may find this dubious, as the subject would seem, therefore, in a sense, to be no more than the ever mobile, volant subject of the discourse, the deployment of a cancer growing in the middle of the world, a world in which a junction occurs in that nevertheless brings the subject alive. But it is not just any old thing that constitutes a subject. We have to be careful here to take things up anew in such a way as not to fall into the confusion of turning the subject back into the thinking subject, because it's not a thinking subject. It's the subject of the unconscious. And I think what he's building up to is also in the way in which we see the subject uh, that manifests as an impossibility in the speech acts of the protesters of 68, waving their demands around, and yet there is the impossible of saying, uh, and then the subject that speaks as well in these things, and also the fact that the protesters were split between the students' demands and the demands of the workers, and how the students were trying to not only express their demands of freedom, of communism, of liberation, but also trying to inscribe that onto the demands of the workers as if they represented their suffering, right? And this is where we see this problem of the speaking subject, the speaking being, in the speech act, and also the impossibility of what is stated, of what is said. Um, Regardless of the pathos of the signifier, I mean, owing to the signifier, this pathos does not in of itself constitute a subject. What defines this pathos is quite simply, in every case, what is known as a fact. Here lies the gap where we must explore what our experience produces, which is something other than, and something that goes much further than the being who speaks, insofar as we are talking about humans. More than one thing in the world is liable to be affected by the signifier. Nothing in this world ever truly becomes a fact or constituted as a fact without the signifier articulating it. No subject ever comes along unless the fact of his existence is said via a signifier. We must work between these two boundaries. The facet of the fact that cannot be said is designated, albeit in the act of saying itself, by its absence, and that is truth. This is why the truth is always insinuated, but can be written too, in a perfectly well calculated way where it has its only place between the lines. Truth's substance is precisely what suffers from the signifier. That goes very far. What suffers owing to its very nature. Let us say, when I say that this goes very far, I mean that it goes very far. Um, I'm sorry, I mean that it goes very far in nature. For a long time, people seem to accept what was known as mind, spirit. It is an idea that became a bit passe, although nothing is ever as passe as you think, because it turns out that it is never anything but the signifier itself that is involved in what goes by the name of mind. And this overturns quite a lot of metaphysics. What relation is there between what we do and metaphysics? And what would a questioning of metaphysics that does not wish to forego the benefit of its experience look like? When what remains of metaphysics in a certain number of points and zones is more varied or plentiful than one might think at first glance, and of quite varied quality. It is also important to know that what structuralism must accomplish. The question is raised in a collection that just came out. I saw the galley proofs and don't know if it is available yet, entitled What is Structuralism? 1968. It was edited by my friend Francois Vall, who called certain people to arms. I advise you to read it, for it brings a number of questions into focus, and it is assuredly quite important to distinguish what we are doing from metaphysics. Yet, before doing so, it is worthy to mention that we must not lend too much credence to the dispelling of illusions that is announced there. Dispelling the illusion of mind is not a complete triumph if it merely transfers to matter, superstitiously characterized as an ideality, the same impassive substance that people use to locate in the mind. I said superstitiously because one can do it in its genealogy. It goes back, oddly enough, to the Jewish tradition. One can, in fact, highlight with what a certain transcendence of matter owes to what is said in the scripture, singularly unnoticed, of course, but altogether clear about God's corporality. I was going to discuss this in my seminar on the names of the Father, which I have crossed off my list. Cross, in quotes, being the operative word, and I cannot return to it today. The materialist superstition, uh, adding the word vulgar to materialism, changes nothing. Richly deserves to love it. Richly deserves the love it receives from one and all, because uh, it clearly, it is clearly what has been most tolerant up until now of scientific thought. But we must not believe that the tolerance in question will last forever. It would be enough for science to come down a bit hard on it for it not to last. It is not unthinkable when we consider how touchy and honorable the member of the Russian Academy of Sciences became one day when I remarked that the word cosmonaut struck me as a misnomer, because nothing in fact seemed less cosmic than such a man's trajectory. He was immediately troubled, bridling on hearing a quip that was, good Lord, so gratuitous. Whatever you may call it, it is not clear, after all, whether you call it God in the sense of the other, or nature with a capital N, which is not the same thing. It is nevertheless to one of those two that we must attribute a priori knowledge of Newton's laws for us to be able to speak of the cosmos and of the cosmonauts. That's all I wanted to say. This is where we sense how much metaphysical ontology continues to be concealed even in the most unexpected of places. Let us return to what is at issue for us. What justifies the rules that grounds psychoanalytic practice? That one known quite simply as free association. Free means nothing other than dismissing the subject. We aren't necessarily successful in dismissing the subject. It is not always enough to dismiss someone for him to leave. What justifies our rule um, is that a subject does not speak the truth, yet suffers from it. Let me label here an occurrence of what I will call phenomenological infatuation. I have already mentioned one of the minor monuments found in a field in which statements are made that seek to corner the market on ignorance. The Essence of Manifestation is the title of a book that has been well received in academia, whose author I need not name since I am about to call him conceited. The essence of his own manifestation, in any case, is the power with which, on a certain page, he articulates that. If there is something that we can be assured of, it is that suffering is nothing more than suffering. It always has an impact when someone tells you that. It's enough to have had a toothache and to have never read Freud to find that quite convincing. I think he's kind of quoting the toothache metaphor or example in on narcissism. Um, but this whole thing about dismissing the subject, right? Um, And I think it goes back to the fact that the subject is going to speak its suffering, even if it doesn't acknowledge it or is aware of it, but we still dismiss it in the fact that we let them move on. We let them carry on smartly. And they come back next session and speak their suffering, whether they or not they know it. And by truth and truth as suffering, it reminds me of Lacan's intro into television where he says, I speak the truth, or at least I try to. It's impossible to say it all or say everything. Um, in the rule of free association, you say what's on your mind, say anything, but not everything because you cannot say everything. You could say anything, but anything doesn't include everything, right? We can thank such intellectuals that the word for them for promoting what shouldn't be said in order to allow us clearly to demarcate what truly should be said. Saying that I too am a bit traditional, I think for I am providing too much justification for his error. And this is why I will add in passing that in saying so, I don't entirely believe it. But to lay out what is at issue, I would have to launch into an apology for sophists, and God only knows where that might lead. Be that as it may, the difference is as follows. If what we analysts do has an effect, it is precisely because suffering is not suffering. To say what must be said, we must say that suffering is a fact. That sounds almost the same, but it is not at all identical. At least if you clearly understood what I said earlier about what a fact is. A fact is only a fact insofar as it is constituted by the signifier. So suffering is not suffering, but suffering is a fact because it's constituted by the signifier. And the signifier is what represents the subject for another signifier, right? And so the subject who is speaking is also absent because the signifier is what takes its place. But the signifier, again, going back to seminar 3, has this annihilating effect. Sam McCormick will say it like this: when the signifier comes up, it's only to say, I am not it, right? I may be suffering, but I am not the thing that you're looking for. I am only a semblance of it. I am only a dismissive uh, parlor trick of what the fact of suffering is, right? This is all what the signifier does, is it plays a trick, and it's always the ego psychologists that fall for the trick of the signifier, right? Because they stay in the imaginarized level of it, meaning, right? Everything has meaning, everything has significance. But that is not at all what the Freudian Lacanian, insofar as they know that suffering is a fact, because the fact is sustained by the signifier. That's the key difference. Let us be more modest. There is suffering that is a fact. In other words, that harbors an act of speaking within itself. It is owing to this ambiguity that we can refute the idea that its manifestation cannot be surpassed. Suffering wants to be a symptom, which means truth. Broaching this for the first time requires that I temper the effect of discourse. So I will make suffering say, just like I did before, truth I speak, although in different terms for each of them and with a tone that is not the same. I am mentioning this merely because I recently highlighted this point. Let us try to be more rigorous as we proceed. Suffering has its own language, and it is quite unfortunate that anyone at all can speak it without knowing what he is saying. But it is, after all, what is unconscious in every discourse. As true discourse is a discourse without speech, as I wrote on the board at our first class this year, once your discourse is rigorously enunciated, anyone can repeat it after you without much consequence. This is one of the dangers of the situation. Let us leave suffering aside as regards truth. Let us indicate what we shall have to bring into focus in what follows. Um, Truth says, in quotes, I, And this defines two upper thresholds, outer limits or maximum range. This is what the one in which the subject can only be located as the effect of the signifier, the one in which there is a pathos of the signifier with no link yet established in our discourse to the subject. This is the field of facts. And secondly, there is what interests us, namely, or something that has never been touched on except on Mount Sinai, namely that which says, I apologize for saying on Sinai. It just slipped out, literally. It just came out from me from between my legs. I did not intend to rush towards Mount Sinai, but since it just tripped off my tongue, I should justify why I did it. And again, it's like a Freudian slip. It just comes out like that, right? I had begun around this little hole, which remains gaping in my discourse known as the name of the Father, to investigate the translation of the word Eya, Azer Eya. I'm afraid I don't pronounce Hebrew well. Greek metaphysicians translate it as I am the one who is because, of course, they had a need for being. But this is not what it means. Other people propose indeterminate terms like I am the one who am. This one received Rome's blessings, but it does not mean anything. I myself pointed out that it should be understood as I am what I am. Indeed, that at least has the value of a punch in the face. You ask me what my name, and I answer, I am what I am, and you can go fuck yourself, which is what the Jews have been doing ever since. I have been thinking anew about how to translate it, but I didn't plan to speak to you about it today. Yet, since Mount Sinai came out regarding the truth that says, since it happened, let's go for it. I believe it must be translated as I am what I is. If Mount Sinai or Sinai slipped out like that, it was in order to illustrate for you what I mean to investigate regarding the status of the I, insofar as the truth says I. Naturally, in the little Parisian cafes where people gossip, rumors would soon have it that, like Pascal, I have chosen the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Let such souls, on whichever side they situate themselves in welcoming this news, set their knee jerk reaction aside, for the truth says, I, but the inverse is not true. Not everything that says I is truth. Where would we be if this were not the case? Which does not mean uh, these remarks are completely superfluous. But you should realize that by calling into question the function of the other on the basis of the very crux of this topology, what I'm shaking up is what Pascal calls the God of the philosophers. It is not an overly pretentious goal, it is truly the issue of our times. Now it is no small matter to call the gods or to call philosophers God, the philosophers God into question because it has hitherto been quite hard to eradicate in the way I alluded earlier. Because what the God of the philosopher is it's the Cartesian God, um, of modern philosophy, and even goes before Descartes. We can even say with like Anselm's, not only the highest conception that we could think, but for Descartes, um, that guarantees the field of knowledge, right, and truth that would not deceive the thinking philosopher. Even if the thinking philosopher that doubts is doubting in a world that allows him to doubt, right, and still bring about certainty. The God of the philosophers is the one that they can conceptualize through faculties of certainty in their reason, right? God is that big A for them. On the contrary, and there's no inconsistency or gap. Right. They would like to think that the inconsistency is in their own reason. And right, we need to put reason into question to understand the consistency of God and the field of knowledge that he provides for us. But it is quite the opposite, right? On the contrary, the other God, as which we render homage to Pascal for having seen that he has nothing to do with philosophers' God, said, I am what I is, whether he spoke truthfully or not. The fact that it was said had a number of consequences. I don't see why, even without glimpsing therein the slimmest chance of truth, we would inform ourselves about certain of these consequences in order to know the status of truth insofar as it says I. It is a bit interesting, for example, to note the following: since truth says I, and the response comes from our interpretation, it is an occasion for we. So since the truth says I and response comes from our interpretation, it is an occasion for we analysts to notice something that I discussed a while back in my seminar on desire and its interpretation. So that's seminar 6. I remarked that by centering the question around I, we must, if only to take it as a warning or even an umbrage, realize that interpretations must be better delineated. Because it's exactly what prophets do. To say I in a certain way, which is not that of suffering, also constitutes interpretation. The other's fate is thus tied not to my question, but to the question that psychoanalytic experiences raises. What is tragic is that um, whatever fate that is calling into question reserves for the other, psychoanalytic experience demonstrates that it is owing to the other's desire that I am following, or I am, in the two senses of this marvelous French homonyms, uh, that I follow, or I am, Jesu, the trail, the trace. This is moreover precisely why I am interested in the other's fate. We still have a quarter of an hour left. I want to discuss a note I received that reads as follows. Last Wednesday, you made a connection without providing any detail between the ordered pair and a signifier, which represents the subject to another signifier. Well, this is quite true. It is of no doubt why my correspondent drew a line underneath it, and below the line wrote the word why with a question mark. Under the word why, he drew another line and then two big dots. One more precisely, two small blackened circles. When the ordered pair was introduced in mathematics, it took a coup de force, an extraordinary feat to create, my correspondent continued. This proves that this person who sent me this piece of paper knows what he's talking about. In other words, that he is a smattering of mathematical knowledge, and probably more than just a smattering. He is quite right. We begin by articulating the function of the set. Um, and if we don't introduce the function of order of pairs through a sort of coup de force known in logic as an axiom, there is nothing more to be done with it than what you initially defined as set. In parentheses, he added, whether direct or indirect, this has two elements. The result of the coup de force is to create a signifier. Okay, so then he's gonna really elaborate on what we talked about in the last one. This takes the place of a coexistence of two signifiers. That is perfectly accurate. He made the second remark. The ordered pair determines these two components, whereas in the formulation, a signifier represents a subject to another signifier. It would be surprising that a subject determines two signifiers. I have only 15 minutes left, but I hope nevertheless to have time to clarify uh, what I said last week, for it is not difficult. Undoubtedly, did not say it clearly enough, since, as you see, someone quite seriously questioned me about it in this way. I never at any moment subsumed the coexistence of two signifiers within the subject. I placed on the board an ordered pair, which, as my interlocutor surely knows, can be written, for example, as follows. So you got the S1 and S2, the two signs, right? And these are going to be, the symbols that are for like the set. Serendipitously turned out to only have two halves of my halogens, which is the fantasy. But in this case, they're merely served to indicate it as an ordered pair. An ordered pair can be translated into a set that is articulated in the sense of the bonus expected from the coup de force. It is thus a set with two elements, which are themselves sets. This first is the set whose member is the first element of the ordered pair. The members of the second set are two elements of the ordered pair. So you have S1, right? And then S1 and S2. So not only are they members of the ordered pair, they're also sets themselves. Far from it being the case here that the subject in any way subsumes the two signifiers in question, our surely can you can see how easy it is to say that the S1 in the first subset does not stop representing the subject, whereas in the second subset renders present most broadly the form of a relationship that we could call knowledge, and that my correspondent called coexistent. The question I'm raising about this is, in its far reaching form, the following: can we conceive of a kind of knowledge that brings together the conjunction of the two subsets into one single set? Can it, going by the name of A for the other with a capital O, be identical to the conjunction such as it is articulated here in a knowledge of the two signifiers in question? This is why, after having designated with the signifier capital A set made of S's, I need no longer to add 1 and 2, since I substituted A for S1 and S2. I investigated what follows therefrom regarding the topology of the other. I showed you in a way that was no doubt only figuratively to be fully satisfied from a logical standpoint, but that nevertheless clearly brought it out. The necessity of the series of circles involuting the symmetry that is forever sustaining A, despite their ever greater apparent interiority. This figuration would suggest a topology in which the smallest of circles joins up with the largest, which I indexed this. If we define A as possibly including itself, in other words, having become absolute knowledge, the odd consequence is that what represents the subject is manifested therein in the form of an infinite repetition. The one you saw inscribed in the form of the S's being endlessly written with a series of circles or walls, to be inscribed only as an infinite repetition of himself. The subject truly excluded, not from a relationship which is either inside or outside, but from what is initially posited as absolute knowledge. It seems like this is where we're getting the inversion between the first formula of the subject, the signifier represents the subject of another signifier, which at the bottom, if you add that little a, as I showed you earlier, we have the master's discourse. And so that impasse leads us to try to encompass A with itself as absolute knowledge, excluding the subject. So how that is excluded in the or how the subject is excluded in this instance, uh, is exactly what the university discourse does, right? It starts off with A trying to address uh what uh is always a remainder, right? While at the same time excluding the subject, right? This remainder being elements, right? Signifies or sets. The university knowledge always tries to account something new to contain itself as absolute knowledge. This is the fantasy, right? If the fantasy of the master is that I am, then the fantasy of the university discourse is I know all, right? To be inscribed only as infinite repetition of himself, the subject is truly excluded not from a relationship which is either inside or outside, but from what is initially posited as absolute knowledge. I mean that in logical structure, there is something that accounts for what Freud's theory fundamentally implies, which is that at the outset, the subject, which with respect to what ties him to some scrap of jouissance, a drop in jouissance, chute de la jouissance, can only manifest himself as repetition, unconscious repetition. This is thus one of the limits around which revolves the link between the reference to absolute knowledge to the subject supposed to know, as we call it in transference, and the index of repetition, repetitive necessity that stems therefrom, which is logically objet A. Objet A is indexed here by the concentric circles. However, what I ended with last time is the other end of the question we must ask, the other with a capital O, inasmuch as we would impose on the condition of not including itself. Capital A only includes S1, S2, and an S3, which are all distinct from what A represents qua signifier. It is possible that in this other form, the subject can be subsumed in such a way without joining back up with the set thus defined as the universe of discourse. He could be sure to remain included therein, question mark. I perhaps glossed over the point a bit too quickly, which is why in concluding, I'm coming back today. There is no more palpable way to depict that element as such than these points. These 3 points are elements of that set that is the fourth point. A can depict once we define this set as an element. So you got these three right here, which creates a circle, and then you have A right here, an element set. If in A there is no A qua element, but only S1, S2, and S3, we say that A is not an element of itself. Can I define the subject in an incredibly simple form uh, by saying that he is precisely constituted, which seems to be exhaustive by any signifier that is not an element to itself? In fact, neither S1 or S2 nor S3 are signifiers like capital A, the latter being the other to all of them. By simply proffering qua speaking subject, or as the subject of the speech act, the proposition that SW, meaning any signifier whatsoever, is not an element of itself, will I be able, by means of speaking or through the speech act, to assemble the signifiers thus defined in a set that brings them all together? By means of speaking, in other words, through a proposition, is something that must be kept in mind in what follows, for it is something around which we must make, first of all, the function of this subject revolved in order to grasp his gap. Regardless of the use you then make of an enunciation, even assuming that it is used as a demand, it is because you have marked the gap that is demonstrated as simply saying that you will be able to most correctly discern the status of desire as a gap, desire's gap, or gap constituted by desire in in the enunciation of demand. Structuralism means that logic is everywhere, even at the level of desire. Lord knows there is more than one way to investigate desire. There are guys who bellow, there are guys who mouth off, and there are gals who dramatize. All of that is equivalent, but you will never know what it means for the simple reason that desire cannot be spoken. Desire is merely the inflection, uh, dissonance of speaking, which is why the inflection must first be homed in on or gripped in pure speaking where logic alone can demonstrate its gap. We are going to form a subset of A. The subset B will include all signifiers S alpha, S beta, S gamma, S delta that are not elements of themselves. This B is in fact the other signifier of my formula S2, the one to which all others represent the subject. That is the one that subsumes them qua subject. In order for X, whatever it may be, to be an element of B, one, it must not be an element of X, and two, it must be an element of A. That's what makes it a subset, because uh it could be an element of A. It just can't be an element of itself, which is X. And of course, it is an element of B. So that's what also makes it a subset, because they share a lot in common, right? What results from this? Is B an element of itself? If it were an element of itself, it would not correspond to the way in which we have constructed it as a set, because it brings together elements that are not elements of themselves. B is thus not an element of itself. If B what is not an element of itself, then it must belong to the subset made up of those elements that are not elements of themselves. Are you all tracking? This is like a better way of which I tried to explain it last time. This is a mouthful, but what we're trying to get at is by using simple logic and axioms on the most formal level, we run into paradoxes, right? Paradoxes of logic of language, right? And this mathematical logic, this formalism, is like a language, but it is not language. It's trying to get at the rules of language, similar to like what the signifier does. Um, but this subset of B, oh wait, but this subset is B itself. And must therefore write that B is an element of B, which is what we rejected earlier. The conclusion we thus arrived at is that B doesn't correspond to the second condition. In other words, it is not an element of A. For those of you who are not used to this sort of reasoning, which is nevertheless quite simple, I will illustrate it even though my illustration here will be altogether childish. I posit B as the other signifier, namely S2. On the left, we have the two positions of B, which are equally unsatisfying, as it can neither be nor be an element of itself. On the right, nor or and not be an element of A, B can only be situated outside. So he has this right here. So you could see this is supposed to be B, right? So this is it being contained by A, and this is A, right? And B is right here, right? So what we're getting at is again is the Russell's paradox all over again. How are you going to translate this exteriority? We will say that in the final analysis, the subject, regardless of how he intends to be subsumed, whether on the basis of a first proposition of the other with a capital O as including itself, or in the other with a capital O as limited to the elements that are not elements of themselves, cannot be universalized. There is no all-encompassing definition with respect to the subject, even in the form of a proposition saying that the signifier is not an element of itself. This also demonstrates not that the subject is not included in the field of the other, but that the point where he is signified qua subject is outside of the other, in other words, outside of the universe of discourse. To say, as I have heard people saying, supposedly repeating my words, that there is no such thing as a universe of discourse means that there is no such thing as discourse at all. Well, it seems to me that if I had not provided a rigorous enough discourse here, you would know nothing about it. Let this serve as an example for our own method and as a resting place for what I hope at next time, or for I hope next time we will be able to make headway within which you have an interest, not only since as analyst you are the live point vivant of it, but also since as analysans you are searching for it. December 4th, 1968. So that concludes facts and what is said. And again, I want you all to tarry with what he leaves us off on because he has still a lot to elaborate on with regards to the subject, the universe of discourse, and the other that does not contain itself, right? And the subject that is outside of it. So there's like two more chapters of the topology of the other section. All right. I hope you all enjoyed that. And again, rewatch the presentation I gave on a topology of the other and the Russell's paradox. Thank you all. Have a good night.